Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. And before we dive into the story, my mom said we can't get to 1,000 subscribers. Can you help me prove her wrong? Go ahead and hit that subscribe button and be part of this journey. Let's show her what we can do. Now, let's dive into the story. The tin cup hit the floor before Nell Kadora could catch it. She dropped to her knees on the sawdust-covered boards, fingers scrambling for the handle, and before she could even stand, the laughter started. It rolled through the saloon like a wave, sharp, ugly, soaked in whiskey. Doyle Crane sat at his corner table, the biggest man in Dustwater, Texas. And tonight, like every night, he was the loudest. He had arms like fence posts, a belly that tested his buttons, and a voice that rattled the bottles on the shelf behind the bar. His boots were propped on the table Nell had just wiped clean, and when he looked at her kneeling on the floor, he smiled the way a cat smiles at a mouse it has no intention of letting go. "Pick it up slow, girl," he said, loud enough for every soul in the room. "At least when you're on your knees, you look useful." The laughter doubled. Men slapped their tables. One threw a corn cob that bounced off her shoulder. Nell's jaw tightened, but she did not look up. She had learned long ago that looking up only made it worse. The saloon was called the Gallows, and it deserved the name. The ceiling was low and smoke-black, hung with oil lanterns that swayed when the wind hit the walls, which it always did, because Dustwater sat on a flat stretch of West Texas, where the wind had nothing to stop it. The floorboards had gaps wide enough to swallow a coin, and the smell, whiskey, tobacco, old leather, and the particular sourness of men who had stopped trying, had soaked so deep into the wood that Nell could smell it on her dress even on the days she did not work, which were rare. She had been here 2 years. 2 years of serving tin cups and dodging hands and smiling at men who called her by names that were not her own. She was 23 years old, and she felt 40. Her hair was the color of red cedar bark, thick and pinned back fast each morning. Her eyes were a pale, fierce gray that men sometimes mistook for emptiness. They were wrong. There was nothing empty behind those eyes. There was patience, calculation, and a fire so carefully held down that even she had begun to forget it was there. But it was there. It had always been there. Doyle was still watching her when she stood. He had paid for everything she owned, which was nothing, because everything she might have owned was already owed back to him. That was the arrangement her father had made 2 winters ago. The arrangement she had inherited the night he died face down in the creek behind their homestead, with 40 of Doyle's dollars still unaccounted for. The sheriff had ruled it an accident. Nell had never believed that. But belief without proof was just grief with nowhere to land, and grief got a woman in Dustwater exactly nothing. So she had taken on the debt. $840, Doyle claimed, though the original figure had been $300. Interest, he said. She called it a trap dressed in polite language. Every month she worked it down, and every month he found a reason to add it back. A broken glass, a torn hem, a plate he insisted she had dropped when she had not. She was not a fool. She knew the math would never clear. But she had been watching, listening, saving small facts the way a woman in her position saved coins, carefully, secretly, for the right moment. The night the stranger rode in, Nell was refilling cups along the back row. It was past 9, late enough that most of the men were too far gone to notice if their whiskey was watered, which it was. because Doyle skimmed every bottle by a third before it reached the bar. The front door opened the way it does when someone large pushes through it, not loudly, but with weight, with a change in the air that made heads turn before anyone knew why. He was lean and trail-worn, dressed in a dark coat dusted at the hem, and his hat was pulled low, but not so low that you missed his jaw. Clean-shaved and sharp, the kind that spoke of a man who made decisions and did not revisit them. He stood in the doorway for 2 breaths, scanning the room with the practiced calm of someone who had learned that rooms can turn on you without warning. Then he crossed to the far end of the bar, set his hat on the counter, and asked for water. Not whiskey. Water. In the gallows. Every head that could turn, turned. Nell was the one sent to bring it, because she was closest and because Doyle liked sending her to new men first, to gauge their response, to see what category of man he was dealing with. She carried the glass across the room and set it in front of the stranger, and he looked up. His eyes were a deep, weathered brown, the kind that had seen enough difficult seasons to no longer be surprised by much. He said thank you. 2 words. Quiet, unhurried, plain. Not the performance of politeness, but the real kind. The kind that meant he had actually seen her standing there. Something small shifted in Nell's chest, something old and sealed, like a door in a house she had locked years ago, moving an inch on its hinges. She stepped back. Doyle was already watching from his corner with that cat smile, and across the room, Garth Pell, Doyle's enforcer, wide as a barn and twice as slow, stood against the wall with his arms crossed, watching the stranger with flat, careful eyes. The night had changed. Nell could feel it the way you feel weather before it arrives. She did not know yet whether that was good. She did not know yet whether the stranger was a door or another wall. But something in her, the part she had spent 2 years trying to silence, had already decided to find out. It had not always been this. That was the thing Nell held on to in the dark hours, in the thin space between the last drunk being thrown out and the first gray light of morning. It had not always been this, and she had not always been this girl. She had been someone else once, someone lighter. She had grown up on a homestead 12 miles east of Dustwater, in a house her father had built with his own hands from cedar and river stone, with a porch that faced west so they could watch the sunsets together. Her mother had died when Nell was 9. Fever, quick and merciless. And after that, it had been just the 2 of them, Nell and her father, Hames Cadora, a tall, gentle man with a laugh that came easy and a temper that came slow. He grew wheat and kept a small herd of cattle and made just enough to keep the land, which was all he asked for. He was not a rich man. He was not even a cautious one. That would be the thing that undid him. That lack of caution, that particular blindness that comes from trusting people who have given you no real reason to. Doyle Crane had arrived in Dustwater the year Nell turned 18, and within 2 seasons, he owned the gallows, 3 rental properties, and a quiet arrangement with Sheriff Tuck Adder that meant very little happened in this town without Doyle knowing, and nothing happened to Doyle without someone paying for it. He was the kind of man who dressed well and spoke softly in public and was understood to be very dangerous in private. Hames Cadora had borrowed money from him the way honest men sometimes borrow money from the wrong people. With good intentions, a reasonable plan, and no awareness of the teeth hidden in the agreement. $300 to repair the homestead's well and buy seed for the spring planting. Doyle had written up the terms himself, in a hand so clean and official-looking that Hames hadn't thought to question them. He should have questioned them. The interest compounded weekly. The land itself was quietly listed as collateral in language buried on the 3rd page. Nell had not known any of this until after her father was dead. She had found him on a Tuesday, face down in the creek, boots still on, the back of his skull bearing a bruise that the county doctor called consistent with a fall, but that Nell, who had grown up on that creek and knew every stone and root of it, knew was consistent with being struck by something heavy and then carried to the water. She had said this to Sheriff Adder. He had looked at her with his pale, flat eyes and told her grief makes people see things that aren't there. She had said it again the next week, with more detail, with the location of the bruise and the fact that the current near that bank ran too, slow to cause the injury she had seen. Adder had told her to get on with her life. She had understood then that there was nothing to be done through the sheriff. She had understood then that in Dustwater, justice was a word people used to mean whatever Doyle Crane permitted. That was the day she started keeping her fire very low and her eyes very open. She had gone to Doyle's office expecting to negotiate the debt, to offer the land in exchange for a clean release. And Doyle had leaned back in his chair and told her the land was already his, per the 3rd page of the agreement, and that the debt itself had grown to $840, and that he had a position available at the gallows that would allow her to work it down. She had asked what the alternative was. He had looked at her for a long moment without answering, and the silence had been its own answer. So she had taken the work. She had kept her chin level and her voice even, and she had stepped into the gallows and started serving cups. She had told herself it was temporary. She had told herself she was gathering information. Both of these things were true. But so was the humiliation. So was the weight of it. Both things could live in the same body at the same time, and she was learning to carry them both without letting either one win. The only person who had spoken to her with anything close to kindness in those 2 years was Bessie Holt, a woman of 50 with silver hair and a limp from an old riding injury, who had been at the gallows longer than anyone, and had long since made her peace with the place in the way that a tree makes its peace with a fence, by growing around it without becoming it. Bessie brought Nell a plate of food on slow nights without being asked. She warned her when Doyle was in a particular kind of mood. She had looked at Nell on her 3rd night, when the humiliation was still raw and new, and said quietly, "Don't let them see you break. The moment they see you break is the moment they think they own something real." Nell had not forgotten that. She had built her whole survival around it, and on the night the stranger walked into the gallows and asked for water instead of whiskey, Bessie had been the one to catch Nell's eye from across the room and raise one careful eyebrow and say nothing, which said everything. Most men who came through Dustwater came through. That was the nature of the town, a stop between the cattle trail and the rail depot at Hector's Crossing, a place to water horses and spend a night before moving on. The stranger did not move on. He took a room at the boarding house across the road, a 2-story frame building with a green door that served breakfast from 6 to 8 and dinner from 5 to 7. And he was at the breakfast table every morning when Nell passed by on her way to the market for Doyle. She noticed this because she noticed everything. She had trained herself to notice everything. His name, she learned from Bessie, who had it from the boarding house proprietor, was Rail Morrow. He was from New Mexico Territory, a rancher, and he had come to Dustwater on business, something to do with land, though the specifics had not been shared. He paid his room bill 3 days in advance and was reported to be quiet and polite, and to have declined 2 separate invitations to drink at the gallows, which in Dustwater was practically eccentric behavior. Nell filed this information carefully. A man who did not drink at the gallows was a man Doyle had no easy grip on. She found that interesting. He came into the saloon again on Thursday, late afternoon, when the crowd was thin and the light came in sideways through the windows in long amber bars that turned the dust in the air to gold. He sat at the bar this time, ordered coffee, which they technically didn't serve, but Nell made anyway, from grounds Bessie kept in the back. And he spent an hour reading a folded newspaper that was 3 weeks old. He did not speak to her beyond ordering, but when she refilled his cup the second time, he looked up and said, "You're good at reading the room." Just that. She paused. In 2 years, not one person in the gallows had said anything to her that was not a demand, a slight, or something worse. She said evenly, "You'd be good at it too, in my position." He looked at her for a moment, not the way men usually looked at her, not sizing up or dismissing, just looking the way you look at something you're genuinely trying to understand. He nodded once. She moved away. Her hands were completely steady. Inside, something in her chest had cracked open another inch. Garth Pell watched all of this from the far side of the room, his thick arms on the table, his eyes tracking Rael Morrow with the steady suspicion of a dog watching a stranger cross familiar ground. Garth was not clever, but he was observant in the blunt way that dangerous men sometimes are, and he had a fine-tuned instinct for anything that might interest Doyle. He waited until Rael had left, then crossed to where Nell was wiping down the bar. He did not say anything. He just stood close enough that she could smell the tobacco and damp leather on him, and looked at her in the flat, warning way of a man who has delivered enough consequences to not need to spell them out. Nell kept wiping the bar. "Something I can help you with, Garth," she said, without looking up. He was silent for another moment, then walked away. She released the breath she had been holding in a long, careful stream and looked out the window at the street where Rael Morrow had gone and thought, whatever he is here for, he needs to be careful. This town will eat him quiet if she lets it. Bessie found her in the kitchen that evening, scrubbing tin cups in a basin of cold water. "You spoke to him," Bessie said, not a question. "A few words," Nell said. Bessie dried her hands on her apron and leaned against the wall. "Doyle's already asking about him. Sent word to Hector's Crossing this afternoon to check if anyone knows the name Rael Morrow." Nell's hands slowed. "What did they find?" "Nothing yet," Bessie said. "But Doyle doesn't like nothing. He finds it suspicious." Nell nodded. She understood. Doyle Crane had built his world out of knowing things, about people, about their debts and their desires and their secrets. And a man who left no easy trail was a man who made Doyle feel, for the first time in a long while, like he was not entirely in control. And a man who made Doyle feel that way had a very short window before things became unpleasant. She finished scrubbing the last cup and set it on the rack and dried her hands and went back out to the floor, where the lanterns were burning and the wind was picking up outside, throwing dust against the windows like it was trying to get in. The next morning, she saw Rael standing outside the land office, 2 doors down from the boarding house. The land office was a small, dusty room managed by a clerk named Voss, who was technically employed by the county, but actually answered to Doyle, because Doyle owned the building Voss lived in. Rael was holding a sheaf of papers and listening to Voss speak, and from across the street, Nell could see by the set of Rael's shoulders that whatever Voss was saying, Rael was not satisfied with it. He had the posture of a man who had been given an answer he already knew was incomplete and was deciding how to respond. He turned and saw her standing there on the walk with her market basket. He did not wave or call out. He simply nodded, the same single deliberate nod as before, and turned back to Voss. Nell kept walking. what she had seen in that half-second of eye contact, something she had not seen directed at herself in a very long time. Steadiness. Not pity, not appetite. Just steadiness, the kind that says, I see you and I am not going anywhere. She gripped her basket and walked on, telling herself very firmly that steadiness in a man was not the same thing as safety. But her heart, which had been very quiet for 2 years, had decided to disagree. Doyle called her to his office on a Friday, an hour before the evening crowd. His office was at the back of the gallows, behind a door with no sign on it, a small square room furnished with a desk, 2 chairs, a locked cabinet where he kept his ledgers, and a photograph on the wall of a city Nell had never been to, that she suspected Doyle had never been to either. He was behind the desk when she came in, jacket on, which meant he was trying to look like something more than what he was. He gestured at the chair across from him with the kind of hospitality that is not hospitality at all. She sat. He folded his hands. You've been talking to the Morrow man, he said. Not an accusation. A fact presented as a warning dressed as a fact. Nell said, He ordered coffee. I brought it. Doyle looked at her with his small, pale eyes, the color of creek water in winter. I'm going to tell you something once, he said, and I won't repeat it, because I respect you enough not to have to. She held very still. He said, That man is not what he looks like. And whatever he has said to you, or whatever you have imagined from whatever he has said to you, you would be smart to put it down and leave it alone. Nell held his gaze without blinking. He hasn't said much of anything, she said. It was true enough. He ordered coffee. He read a newspaper. He left. Doyle watched her for a long moment, the way a man watches a poker hand he isn't sure about. Then he smiled. The smile was the worst thing about him, because it looked almost warm. Good, he said. He opened the ledger on his desk to a page near the back. I've been reviewing your account. You're making progress. She knew this was a lie, but she looked at the numbers he pointed to and nodded. Another 14 months, he said, at current rate, and you'll be clear. 14 months. He had told her 12 months 2 months ago. She kept her face neutral. I appreciate you telling me, she said. He nodded as if this were a generous thing, which it was not. She stood and moved toward the door, and just as her hand touched the frame, he said, without looking up from the ledger, Women who get ideas in this town tend to find their debt gets complicated. She stopped. She did not turn around. I understand, she said, and walked back out to the floor, where the lanterns burned and the smell of whiskey met her like a familiar enemy. That night, she watched Garth Pell cross the street and enter the boarding house. And she watched him come back out 12 minutes later, looking satisfied in the blunt, dull way he always looked when he had done something Doyle had asked him to do. She did not know what he had said to Rail Morrow, or whether Rail was still in his room, or whether Garth had only gone to sniff around. But the next morning, Rail was at breakfast in the boarding house window like nothing had changed, cutting a piece of bread with a quiet patience that suggested he was either very calm by nature or very used to being warned off things. She told herself this was not her concern. She had enough of her own dangers to manage without absorbing someone else's. She spent the morning doing the saloon's accounts, which Doyle let her handle because she was better with numbers than anyone else he had, though he did not phrase it as a compliment. She found, buried in a column of supply costs, a charge that did not correspond to any delivery she could remember. $400, marked as a settlement fee, dated the week her father died. She stared at it for a very long time. Then she copied the entry into a small notebook she kept folded in her boot, closed the ledger, and went back to work. Bessie was in the kitchen when Nell came in with her face arranged carefully into its working expression. The one that looked like patience and was actually iron. Bessie looked up and said, "You found something." It was not a question. Nell sat down on the low stool by the stove and said quietly, "There's a payment in Doyle's accounts, $400, the week my father died." Bessie was quiet for a moment. The fire in the stove popped and settled. "Settlement fee," Nell said. "I don't know what for. There's no name, no explanation." Bessie set down what she was holding. She said just as quietly, "Nell, what do you think that is?" Nell said, "I think it's what I've always thought it was. I just didn't have any paper to point to before now." The two women looked at each other across the small kitchen, and what passed between them was not panic. Panic was a luxury neither of them had ever been able to afford. But something harder and older than panic. It was recognition. The recognition that a thing they had suspected in the dark had just stepped into the light, and that the light changed what was possible. She needed to be careful. More careful than she had ever been. Because if Doyle discovered she had copied that entry, if Garth saw her notebook, if even the suspicion of what she knew reached Doyle before she was ready, she would not be warned again. She had seen what warnings looked like, and she had seen what came after them, floating face down in a creek on a cold Tuesday morning. She thought about Rail Morrow across the street with his newspaper and his deliberate nod. And she thought, "I don't know what this man is or what he wants in Dustwater, but I know that Doyle is afraid of him, and Doyle is not afraid of much. And a man that Doyle is afraid of is either a very dangerous thing or exactly the kind of thing a woman in my position should know more about." She tucked the thought away with the others. Careful, tight, waiting for its moment. And went back out to the floor, where the evening crowd was starting to arrive and the lanterns were beginning their nightly sway. She did not go to him. She was too careful for that, and too proud. But the town was small, and the morning market was unavoidable, and on a pale, cold Saturday with a wind that carried dust and the distant smell of rain, Rail Morrow was at the market stall buying dried provisions, and she was there buying coffee grounds for Bessie, and they stood 3 feet apart selecting things from adjacent baskets, and it would have been stranger not to speak than to speak. So she spoke first. "Garth Pell came to your room," she said quietly, looking at the coffee. "Thursday night." He did not look up from the provision sack he was filling. "He did," he said. "What did he say?" she asked. "He told me the accommodations in Dustwater are limited, and I might find the road to Hector's Crossing more comfortable." Nell Smarazaldi almost smiled. "And?" He said, "I told him I found my room quite comfortable and thanked him for his concern." She did look at him then, just briefly. That's a dangerous answer to give Garth Pell. "Most honest answers are," he said. He closed the provision sack and looked at her, openly, without the careful sideways glance that men in the gallows used, but directly, with those weathered brown eyes. "I'm here for the Cadora land," he said. The world went very still. She heard the wind. She heard the man at the next stall calling his prices. She heard her own breath. "That's my father's land," she said. Her voice was level. Her hands were not. "I know," Rail said. "It was purchased at county recording 3 months ago, recorded under Crane's Holding Company. I have a prior claim. My father and your father made an arrangement in 1874, before either of us were old enough for it to matter much. 23 acres of the eastern parcel, deeded, verbally but never formally recorded. In exchange for water rights my father extended to your family during the drought year." He reached inside his coat and produced a folded document, worn at the creases, and held it out. She did not take it immediately. She looked at it, then at him. "You rode all the way from New Mexico for 23 acres, she said. It was not a question. It was a test. He said, "The 23 acres matter, but so does the reason they were taken." A pause. The wind lifted dust around their boots. "Your father did not fall into that creek," he said very quietly. She felt the fire behind her ribs flare up hot and sudden, and it took everything in her to hold it there, to not let it show on her face in the middle of the market where anyone could see. "No," she said. He did not. They did not speak for long. Long enough would have been noticed. But before they separated, he said, "I have people I trust. A lawyer in San Angelo. A land agent in Fort Stockton. What I need is the record of the original debt agreement. The paper your father signed. Do you know if it still exists?" She thought of Doyle's locked cabinet. She had seen the cabinet. She had counted the locks. She knew which key on Doyle's ring, because she had watched him open it 40 times, and a woman who serves men all day learns where their eyes go and where their hands go and what it means. "It exists," she said. "I don't have access to it, but I know where it is." He nodded once. "Don't reach for it yet," he said. "Not until I'm ready." She said, "I've been waiting 2 years. I can wait a little longer." He looked at her then, just looked quietly, for a moment that held weight without any particular drama, and said, "You shouldn't have had to wait at all." She turned and walked back toward the gallows, her basket on her arm, her steps even and unhurried. And if her eyes were bright, it was not from weakness. It was from something she had nearly forgotten the taste of. The possibility of a way out that was not surrender. That afternoon, Doyle was in a foul humor. 2 of his rental properties had reported the same tenant complaining about repairs, and a letter had arrived from the county assessor that he read twice and then locked in his cabinet with a set jaw. Nell watched all of this from the corners of her vision as she worked the floor, reading him the way she always read him, tracking the shifts in his mood the way you track weather, because weather can kill you if you miss the signs. He snapped at Garth twice. He kicked a chair out of his path, crossing the room. He looked at Nell once, a sharp, assessing look, and she gave him her working face, patient, blank, useful, and he looked away. But something in her knew that Doyle was putting pieces together, the way men like him always did, slow but eventually correct, and that the window she and Rail Morrow had was narrower than it looked. She caught Bessie's eye near the kitchen door. Bessie gave her a small, tight nod that meant, "I see it too. Be careful." Nell filled another cup and carried it across the room, her steps as smooth and ordinary as they had been for 2 years, while underneath, something in her that had been still for a very long time was quietly, carefully beginning to move. She lay awake that night in her small room above the saloon, listening to the wind work at the window frame. She thought about the document Rail had shown her, worn at the creases, carried a long way. She thought about a man who came to a town like Dustwater, over 23 acres, and a principal. She thought about what it meant that he had looked at her in the market, not with pity, not with appetite, but with the plain, unguarded look of someone who simply found her worth looking at. She pressed her hand flat against the wall beside her bed, against the boards that separated her from the saloon below where men had mocked her for 2 years. and she made herself a quiet promise. Not a dramatic one, not a loud one. Just a small, iron thing, formed in the dark and tucked away, with all the other small iron things she had been building since the morning she found her father in the creek. She was not going to spend another winter in this room. One way or another, she was not. It was a setup. She knew it the moment it happened, but knowing does not stop a trap from closing. A man named Orson Flagg, a regular, thick-necked and small-eyed, one of Doyle's informal friends in the way that many men in Dustwater were Doyle's informal friends, dropped his wallet near the bar on a Sunday evening, then turned around 10 minutes later and loudly accused Nell of taking it. He said he had seen her reach toward his coat. He said his wallet had contained $30. He said it clearly, in a room full of men who were primed to believe it. Because Doyle had primed them? Probably before Flagg had even walked in the door. Nell did not panic. She said calmly that she had not touched his wallet, and she turned out her apron pockets, which held nothing but a bar rag and a short pencil. Flagg said she must have hidden it somewhere. Doyle came out from his corner with his hands open and his voice reasonable, the performative reasonableness that was one of his most effective weapons, and said that he was sure there was a simple explanation, but perhaps Nell should go to her room and wait while they sorted it out, which would mean Nell was as good as convicted in every man's mind in the room. She did not go. She stood where she was and said, very clearly, "I will not go to my room because I did nothing. If Mr. Flagg believes he has lost his wallet, he should retrace his steps. I suggest starting at the table where he spent the last 2 hours, which is where men usually lose things when they've been drinking." There was a silence, a long one. Doyle's expression did not change, which was itself a sign. It meant he was recalibrating. Flagg turned red in the neck and started to say something louder, and that was when the door opened. Rail Morrow walked in. He should not have been there. He had specifically avoided the gallows on evenings. But he was there, and the room turned to look at him. And he read the situation in about 4 seconds with those calm, practiced eyes. And he crossed the room without urgency and picked up something from the floor under the bar. The wallet, slim and dark, which had apparently slid from where Flagg had staged the drop and fallen further than intended. He held it up. "Is this what you're looking for?" he said, looking at Flagg with an expression of complete pleasantness. Flagg's face went from red to a complicated shade that wasn't quite either. The room went very quiet. Doyle looked at the wallet in Rail's hand, and then at Nell, and then at Rail, and something moved through his face that was too fast to name but not too fast to feel. It was the particular shift of a man who has just watched his move countered and is deciding what to do about the person who countered it. He said, "Well, there we go. Mystery solved," in his reasonable voice, and waved for drinks to be poured, which dissolved the crowd back into itself with the practiced ease of a man who had diffused his own setups 100 times before. But the wave of his hand, when he turned away, was a half-second too sharp, and Nell saw it, and she filed it. Rail set the wallet on the bar in front of Flagg without a word, and turned and left. He did not look at Nell. He did not need to. She looked at the bar top and breathed, slow and even, and inside the banked fire in her chest had jumped 2 feet higher, and she held it, because the time was not yet. Later, Bessie found a folded note that had been slid under the kitchen door. It said, in a plain, unhurried hand, "Tomorrow, 7 in the morning, Creek Road, East Bend. Come alone. R.M." Bessie read it, looked at Nell, and tucked it into Nell's apron pocket without a word. Nell went back out to the floor. She served the remaining men their drinks with a face so ordinary and composed that even Garth Pell, watching her from his usual wall, could find nothing in it to report. This was the gift of 2 years of practice. 2 years of being looked at without being seen. She had learned to carry an entire interior world without a single word of it surfacing. The men in this room had spent 2 years convinced she was nothing but a serving girl with a debt and no options. She had let them believe it. It had been, she thought now, the most useful thing she had ever done. She was at the east bend of the creek road at 7 the next morning. So was Rail. The sky was a pale, washed blue, and the creek ran low and clear over its stones, and the willow trees along the bank were just beginning to show their first gray-green, and for a moment, just a moment, she stood in the early light and looked at the water and thought of her father. And the grief was clean and sharp and brief, the way grief can sometimes be when you are close to doing something about the thing that caused it. Rael was leaning against a willow, holding 2 cups of coffee in a tin carrier from the boarding house. He held one out to her. She took it. They stood there in the morning light by the creek, drinking coffee, 2 people with separate plans that were beginning to find the same direction. And for the first time in 2 years, Nell felt something she recognized only slowly, because it had been away so long. She felt, for a few minutes at least, like a person. Not a debtor, not a serving girl, not a cautionary tale. Just a person, standing by a creek in the morning, drinking coffee, with somewhere still to go. Rael laid it out plainly, the way she had come to expect from him. He had a lawyer, a man named Cass Dunmore in San Angelo, who had reviewed the Cadora land records and found 3 separate irregularities in the filing that had transferred the land to Doyle's holding company. The transfer had been rushed through the county recorder in the week after Hames Cadora died, before the estate had been properly probated, which meant it was legally questionable at minimum and potentially void. Dunmore was preparing papers. What he needed to move forward was one of 2 things. Either the original debt agreement, the one Hames had signed, which would show the fraudulent interest terms, or a corroborating witness to the circumstances of the debt itself. Nell thought of the entry in Doyle's ledger, the $400 settlement fee with no name attached. She told Rael about it. She told him she had copied the details into a notebook she kept in her boot. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "That note will matter. But the original document is what breaks the case open. Without it, Dunmore can challenge, but Doyle's lawyers will delay indefinitely, and the land stays tied up." She looked at the creek. She said, "I can get it." He was quiet for a moment. A bird moved through the willows. The creek ran on. "Tell me how," he said. She told him about the cabinet, the key on Doyle's ring, the fact that Doyle left the key ring on his desk every morning between 6:30 and 7 when he went upstairs to wash and dress. She had seen this. She had timed it, without knowing exactly why at first, simply because timing things was how she stayed sane. 20 minutes, sometimes 25. The office door was not locked during that window because Doyle considered his presence in the building sufficient protection, and in dust water, he had generally been correct. Rael listened to all of this without moving, and when she finished, he said, "That's a serious risk." She said, "I know." He said, "If you're caught," she said, "I know what happens if I'm caught." A silence. Then she said, "I've been calculating risks since I was 21. I am very good at it. Let me do this part." He looked at her steadily. She looked back. He said, "All right, but not until I have the lawyer's papers ready to file. The moment you have the document, Dunmore files that same day, before Doyle can react. which means we need everything in place first. She nodded. Then she said, because she had been carrying it, and it needed to be put somewhere. He had my father killed. Not a question. Rail said, I believe so. The people I talked to in the county, people Doyle doesn't know I've talked to. There are 2 men who were paid that week. One of them drank too much in Hector's Crossing last year and said something he shouldn't have. It got back to someone who got back to Dunmore. Nell looked at the water. The grief was there, clean and sharp as it had been when she first arrived. But there was something else alongside it. Now, something harder and cleaner than grief. That had no ordinary name but felt like the difference between being rained on and picking up a weapon. She said, will there be a charge? For what he did to my father? Rail said, Dunmore is talking to the county prosecutor in San Angelo. It depends on the evidence, but the land case alone will break Doyle's hold in this town. And a man without a hold in this town is a man who can be touched. She held that thought. It was not enough. It would have to be enough for now. 3 days later, she passed him on the street and he said, without stopping or slowing, 2 more days. Dunmore is ready. She kept walking. That evening, Doyle called her into his office again, and this time his face was different, harder, with an edge she had not seen before. The edge of a man who has sensed something moving in the dark and doesn't know where it is. He told her that her debt had been reviewed and was being transferred. She went. She still. Transferred? She said. He said a business associate in Amarillo had purchased several of his accounts receivable, and hers was among them, which meant starting the 1st of the month she would be traveling to Amarillo to continue working it down there. He said it smoothly, in the polite language of business, but she heard what it was. A brothel. Not necessarily, but very possibly, and even if not, a different city, a different Doyle, and no Rail Morrow within 40 miles. She kept her face as still as the surface of standing water. When? She said. 1st of the month, he said. 2 weeks. She nodded. She said, I understand. She walked back out. Inside, the fire had gone white hot. She sent word to Rail that night through Bessie, who passed a folded note to the boarding house proprietor with a coin and a request, and the proprietor, who had always disliked Doyle's grip on the town and liked money, passed it on. The note said, It has to be tomorrow. I'll explain when I see you. She lay awake that night, listening to the wind and going over every step of what she planned to do. Over and over. The way you rehearse a thing until your hands know it without your mind's permission. She had 1 shot. She had known for 2 years that she would probably have 1 shot at this, and now the shot was here. And the question was not whether she was ready. She was. The question was whether everything she had built, every small, careful iron thing, would hold under the weight of tomorrow. She woke before 5. She dressed slowly, carefully, in clothes that made no sound. Her softest boots, her darkest blouse. Bessie was already in the kitchen when she came down, a lantern burning low, a plate of bread on the table. Bessie did not ask anything. She just set the plate there and squeezed Nell's hand once and went back to her preparations for the day. Because the kindest thing Bessie could do was make the morning look ordinary. Nell ate, the bread standing up. She went to the bar and filled cups and set out chairs and swept the floor as she always did. Every movement deliberate and routine, nothing to see, nothing to notice. The clock on the wall moved towards 6:30 with the slow indifference of clocks. At 6:28, she heard Doyle's footsteps on the stairs, heavy, even, unhurried. And she heard him cross the landing, heard his office door, heard the chair creak as he sat, heard the familiar sounds of the morning as she had heard them every day for 2 years, cataloged and memorized without ever saying why. Then at 6:35, she heard him rise, heard his steps go toward the back stairs that led to his upstairs quarters, heard the water pitcher, and she moved. She moved fast, not running sounds, but the quick, soft step of a woman who had crossed this room 10,000 times and knew every board that spoke and every one that didn't. Doyle's office door had no lock from the outside. She pushed it open 1 inch, 2, slipped through, held it behind her. The room smelled of tobacco and old paper and something metallic she had never been able to name. The key ring was on the desk, just as it always was. A heavy brass ring with 8 keys, each one she had learned by shape and position over 2 years of watching. The cabinet key was the 4th one, short-shafted with a single tooth. She crossed to the desk, lifted the ring without a sound, crossed to the cabinet, found the key by touch, opened the lock in one smooth motion. And the way you open a lock when you have rehearsed it enough times in your mind that your fingers do not need to think. The cabinet swung open. 3 shelves of ledgers and files, organized in a system she understood because she had been the one, at Doyle's instruction 2 years ago, to help reorganize it. She knew exactly where the oldest contract files lived. Top shelf, left corner, green folder. It was there. Her father's, handwriting on the signature line. Hames Cadora, in the careful, deliberate script of a man who had not signed many official documents and wanted to do it right. She pulled the document free. She read the terms, quickly, and the interest structure was exactly as predatory as she had known it would be, compounding at a rate that no honest lender used, buried in language designed to be misread. She folded it once and tucked it inside her blouse, against her skin, where it lay warm and paper flat. She replaced the green folder. She closed the cabinet. She relocked it. She crossed back to the desk and replaced the key ring on its exact position, orientated as it had been, because she had looked at it on the way in. She crossed to the door, listened, heard Doyle still upstairs, heard water, heard his boots on the floor. She slipped out, pulled the door to its original position, and was behind the bar with a cloth in her hand by the time his footsteps started back down the stairs. 12 minutes. She had been in that room for 12 minutes. It had felt like an hour and also like a breath. She found Rail at the Creek Road at 7:15. Later than planned, he was there. She pulled the document from inside her blouse and held it out to him. And when he unfolded it and read the terms, his jaw tightened in a way she had not seen before. Not anger exactly, but the cold, precise recognition of confirmed wrongdoing in a man who cares about what is right. He looked up from the paper. She said, "I also found this," and showed him the copy she had made in her notebook, the settlement fee entry. He took the notebook carefully, like it was something that deserved to be handled carefully, which it did, and looked at the entry and nodded. He said, "Done more files today. I'm riding to the telegraph office in the next hour." She said, "Doyle is transferring my debt to someone in Amarillo. 2 weeks." He looked at her. "You will not be in Dustwater in 2 weeks," he said. Simple, certain. Not a promise made carelessly, but the kind made by a man who has already thought through what it will cost him to keep it. She looked at him for a long moment, and then, for the first time in 2 years, something in her face moved that she had not permitted there. It was not quite crying, but it was adjacent to it, and she turned away quickly so he would not see, and looked at the creek and breathed. She went back to work. She served cups and swept floors and smiled at men who mocked her, and she carried the fire in her chest like a lantern in a storm. both hands cupped around it, keeping it alive. Garth Pell watched her from his wall. Doyle watched her from his corner. Neither one saw anything they could use, because there was nothing to see. She had learned this in the hardest school there is, survival. And she had graduated at the top of her class. At noon, a rider came through town from the direction of San Angelo, stopped at the land office, exchanged words with Voss the clerk, and rode on. Voss came out onto the boardwalk and looked up and down the street with an expression that told her Dunmore's papers had been filed. She felt it in her chest. Not triumph, not yet. Because triumph before the thing is finished gets you killed. But she felt it. Like the first cold drop of rain on dry ground before a storm. Something was coming. Something had been set in motion that Doyle Crane, for all his power in this particular pocket of Texas, could not now stop. She filled another cup. She carried it across the room. She set it down. She went back for the next one. And she waited. It happened on a Thursday, 12 days after the filing. Doyle had been quiet for those 12 days in a way that was not peace, but preparation. The stillness of a man who has received news he doesn't like and is deciding the sharpest angle of response. He had sent Garth to San Angelo twice. He had made 3 trips to the telegraph office, himself. He had spoken to Sheriff Adder behind closed doors twice, and each time Adder came out, he looked less comfortable than when he went in, which was a thing Nell watched with careful attention. The thing she had not anticipated was that Doyle's response would not be slow and legal. It would be fast and physical. She should have anticipated it. She had lived next to this man for 2 years. She knew what he was under the reasonable voice and the polished manners. She knew that when pressed, what he reached for was force. She had simply allowed herself to believe, in those last 12 days, that the papers and the lawyer and the filing would be enough to hold him in check until the law could act. She had been wrong. Garth Pell came for her on a Thursday evening, just before the crowd arrived, when the saloon was near empty and Bessie was in the kitchen and the street was quiet. He came with another man, one she didn't know, thick and silent, carrying a saddlebag, and Garth told her that her transfer had been moved up, that she was leaving tonight, that she could bring what she could carry and the rest would be sent on. And his voice had the particular flat finality of a man who is not making an offer, but delivering a verdict. She said calmly that she was not going anywhere. He moved toward her. The man with the saddlebag moved to block the door. Bessie appeared in the kitchen doorway, took one look at the scene, and was gone. Nell stood her ground. Her heart was going fast, but her hands were still. She said, "Doyle cannot move me. There are legal proceedings underway. I am a named party." Garth said, "Doyle says otherwise." She said, "The county court in San Angelo says otherwise." Garth reached for her arm. She stepped back, and behind her the saloon door swung open hard enough to hit the wall. Rail Morrow came through the door, and behind him were 2 men she did not know. One of them carrying a paper with an official seal that she recognized later as a temporary injunction issued by the San Angelo court. The other was a badge-wearing stranger who was not Sheriff Adder, whose name was Deputy Marshal Cord Ives, and who had ridden the whole day from the county seat to serve a warrant. The warrant was for Doyle Crane, not for the land fraud, for the murder of Hames Cadora. The 2 witnesses had come forward. The men Rail's contacts had located, the ones who had spoken too loosely in Hector's Crossing. And Dunmore had moved faster than even Rail had expected. Garth went for his gun. Deputy Marshal Ives was faster and more measured, and in 30 seconds Garth was on the floor with his hands behind his back. and the man with the saddlebag had decided correctly that leaving was the best available option and was already gone. The room was silent. Outside, Nell could hear boots on the boardwalk. Doyle, coming from around the back, alerted by the noise. He came through the rear door and stopped when he saw Ives and the warrant and the sealed paper and Rail Morrow standing in his saloon with that same steady, deliberate calm that had unnerved Doyle from the first night. And Doyle looked at all of it, and the reasonable voice fell off him like a coat. And what was underneath was the thing Nell had always known was there. Raw and backed into a corner and very dangerous. He looked at Nell. His eyes were no longer pale and calculating. They were something else, something that had no name she wanted to give it. He said, "You did this." Not an accusation, just the naming of a fact. She met his eyes. She said, "My father did this. He kept a record. He told people. And the truth takes longer than murder, but it usually arrives." It was the longest thing she had said to him in 2 years. He stood very still. Then Deputy Marshal Ives read the warrant, and 2 things happened at once. Doyle moved for the cabinet behind him, and Rael moved to block the door, and Ives stepped between Doyle and the cabinet with a hand on his sidearm. And Doyle looked at the 3 points of the triangle around him and made the only calculation left available to him, which was that there was none, and he stood still while the cuffs were put on his wrists. They took Doyle and Garth out through the front of the gallows into the main street of Dustwater in the last red light of the evening, and the street was not empty. Word had spread the way word always spreads in a small town, faster than anyone sends it. People stood on their boardwalks. The clerk Voss was there. The boarding house proprietor was there. Men who had sat in that saloon and laughed at Nell every night for 2 years were there, watching Doyle Crane in handcuffs walk past them in the red light. And the silence was the kind of silence that reshapes a town, that settles into a community's memory and changes how people see themselves, what they thought they were part of. Nell stood in the doorway of the gallows and watched him go. Bessie was beside her, and after a moment, Bessie put her arm around Nell's shoulders, just briefly, and Nell let herself lean in for exactly 2 seconds before she straightened again. Rael was on the street, speaking quietly to Ives. He looked back at her once. She was still standing in the doorway. She was still standing. 2 weeks later, Nell Cadora left Dustwater on a clear morning in early April, with the sky the particular blue of a spring morning that believes in what it's doing. She left with her father's land restored to the estate by court order, with Doyle Crane remanded to the San Angelo County Jail pending trial, with a receipt in her pocket showing the debt she had carried for 2 years officially voided, null and void by order of the same court that had voided the fraudulent transfer, and with a small leather bag that held everything she owned that mattered, which was less than it should have been and more than it had been the night her father died. Bessie walked with her to the edge of town. Nell stopped there, and they stood for a moment in the new morning light, and Bessie said, "You were always too good for this town." Nell said, "You are also too good for this town." Bessie smiled her particular smile, the one she used for things that were true and could not be changed, and said, "Maybe, but I'm better at it." They held each other for a moment, and then Nell walked on, and she did not look back, because she had learned that looking back at the wrong things will stop you. Rail's ranch was in the high country west of the Pecos, 2 days' ride from Dustwater, set on a stretch of land that ran up against a low ridge of cedar-covered hills and opened to the south into a wide, golden valley that caught the afternoon light and kept it. The house was stone and timber, not large but solid, built to last by a man who intended to stay, A porch that faced the valley. A kitchen with a real iron. Stove. A garden plot along the south wall where something green was already coming up through the turned earth. She had not known what to expect. She had not let herself expect anything specific, because expectation was a vulnerability she had trained herself out of. But when she saw it, the house, the ridge, the valley, the way the light lay across it all in a way that felt like something she recognized from a time before everything went wrong, something in her chest opened up so wide and so fast that she had to stop the horse and just sit with it for a moment. Rael showed her everything without ceremony and without performance. The room that would be hers, the east bedroom, with a window that caught the sunrise, with real curtains and a real bed and a quilt that had been made by someone's hands a long time ago. The kitchen where he cooked with the focused attention he gave most things. The porch where he sat in the evenings, the well, the garden, the horses. He showed her all of it the way you show someone a place you hope they will come to love, without telling them they should. He introduced her to the two hands who worked the land with him. An older Mexican man named Evaristo and his nephew, both of whom tipped their hats to her with complete normalcy, as though her arrival were a plain and unremarkable thing, which was the greatest kindness they could have offered. At dinner the first evening, she sat at a table with a cloth on it and plates that were not tin, and there was bread and roast chicken and coffee that was not watered. And no one said anything to demean her, and no one looked at her as though she owed them something. And she ate in a silence that was not the silence of the gallows, but the good kind. The kind that means everyone at the table is exactly where they should be. She did not fall in love with him like a story. She was not built for the sudden kind of love, not after everything. And neither was he. It was the slower kind. The kind built of mornings when he brought her coffee before she asked, and evenings when they sat on the porch and watched the last light go out of the valley, talking sometimes and sometimes saying nothing at all. The kind built of him, handing her things she needed before she asked for them, and her reading the land and the way she had always read rooms and finding it spoke a language she recognized, a language of effort and patience, and the particular dignity of work that is yours. The kind built of him saying, one evening in the 5th week, quietly and without embellishment, that she was the most capable person he had ever known, and that he was sorry for the 2 years she had spent proving it in conditions no one should have been asked to endure. She looked at the valley for a while after he said that. Then she said, "Don't feel sorry. It made me certain of what I'm worth." He looked at her. He said, "What are you worth?" She said, "More than I was given." Nodded. He said yes. The trial of Doyle Crane concluded in the fall, 9 months after his arrest, in a San Angelo courtroom. He was convicted of land fraud and the solicitation of the murder of James Cadora, on the testimony of 2 witnesses and the evidence of the fraudulent debt papers, and sentenced to 15 years in the state penitentiary. Sheriff Adder resigned his position before the trial and left the county, which was the closest thing to justice the law could arrange for a man of his particular cowardice. Nell attended the verdict. She sat in the public gallery in a good dress, the best she had owned in years, with her hands folded in her lap and her back straight, and her gray eyes steady on the judge's face as he read the sentence. And she did not cry, and she did not cheer. She simply sat with the fact of it. Let it settle in. Let it find the place in her it was meant to occupy. The place where grief and patience had lived together for 3 years, the fragment. Place that needed something to land there and give it peace. She thought of her father. She thought of his laugh. She thought of the porch they had sat on together, watching sunsets before the world had decided to test them both. Then she stood and straightened her dress and walked out of the courtroom into the high, clean light of a San Angelo October and went home. Not home to Dustwater, not home to the gallows or the small room above it or the life that had been built around her like a cage while she was not looking. Home to the ranch on the Pecos, with the Cedar Ridge and the Golden Valley and the porch that faced the afternoon. Home to real coffee and a quilt made by someone's hands and a man who saw her, actually saw her, and a garden along the south wall, where by October the beans she had planted in April had long since come in and been harvested, and the earth had been turned again for the spring. She arrived as the sun was getting low, and Rael was on the porch, and Evaristo was closing up the barn for the night. And the cedar hills were orange at their edges, and the valley below them was the color of something she did not have a name for, but recognized as good. She got down from the horse and stood for a moment in the last of the light. Rael looked at her. She looked at him. She said, "It's done." He said, "Come sit down." She did. They sat on the porch in the evening light of the Pecos country, and the wind came off the Cedar Ridge clean and cold, and somewhere below in the valley, a hawk turned slow circles over the grass, and it was enough. It was, after everything, entirely enough. If this story moved you, drop A and tell us. What hit hardest for you? Was it Nell's patience, the moment Doyle was arrested, or the porch at the end? Comment below. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is your sign. New stories every week. Don't miss the next one.